Okay, so I'm going to talk to you about what I see as some of the key challenges of the budget and what I would recommend as being some responses and some comments on some of the responses that have been floated in the press. So, the key central issue in this budget is how far will the OBR project Osborne will miss his fiscal targets on his old plan, given the growth slowdown, and how Osborne will respond to that. That's the key question. So the three key variables in my view to look out for from the OBR. The first is how bad will growth be over the next couple of years. We've heard a little bit of a discussion of that. The next is how much will the OBR estimate of the sustainable growth rate and hence the output gap have fallen. And we've heard mention of that. I'll explore a little why that matters. And what difference does this make for Osborne's target of eliminating the structural current deficit by 2015-16? And I'm going to tell you why I think it's quite wrong to claim that he can move his target forward a year, and his commitment for debt to be falling relative to GDP by 2015-16. So the OBR suggests that the sustainable growth rate is currently about 2.35, will fall to about 2.1. Certainly with the, and that's a reflection of an idea that although there have been a bit, perhaps, of a slowdown in how fast the economy could grow over the longer term, partly as a consequence of heavy indebtedness and the financial crisis and all kinds of other things, it had only fallen a little bit from the kind of 2.5, 2.75 numbers that people have been talking about before. I think that in my view, that's been enormously over-optimistic for years, the government's official view of the sustainable growth rate. I think that if they don't downgrade to any number, they've got to downgrade that 2.1, right? I would think they should probably be looking at something like 1.7. I have to tell you, on my models, it's currently about 1.1. Right? So if they were to only downgrade to 1.7, they're still way above the kinds of things which I think are actually the truth. But if they don't give some ground on that, if you don't look at these circumstances and say, look, the reality is that this economy can't grow nearly so fast as we thought. In the period after, the 2 decades after Japan had its problems in the early 1990s, it grew only 1% a year. If we've had a worse financial crisis than they have, we have worse problems as we begin than they had as they began. And if we were to sustain the growth rate over the next decade, which they grew at, we'd think that was a pretty good performance, I think. And the idea that we can be growing at 2.35 over the next decade as an average, I think is preposterous and has been for some time. However, I do think that they should expect that they can grow, that they can increase that growth rate. It's perfectly plausible to think you can increase that growth rate by something close to the end of the forecasting period. In my view, you should be able to get north, you should have an ambition of getting that north of 2% by about 2017. Right? And so that means that the government should be telling us some things in the growth plan about how it increases the long-term sustainable growth rate of the economy. Not how it gets a little bit of extra growth this year or next year. Because the fundamental problem in our economy is not a matter of how much we grow over the next 18 months, how much we grow over the next quarter. That's not the issue. The issue is if we do not grow fast enough over the medium term, our households are going to default on their enormous debts. That will drag down our banking sector and drag down the sovereign. Growth has always been the key problem, and it's not a matter of growth. It's not enough to have a little bit of extra growth, a few 0.1s here and there over the next couple of years. It's that long-term sustainable growth rate we have to increase. And the government should be telling us how it will do that. The one way that Osborne should definitely not respond, absolutely definitely not respond to this, is the way which has been floated in the press and in various interviews over the past few days, is by claiming that when you look at the fine print of the emergency budget, turns out that he was never really committed to a 2015-16 target for eliminating the structural deficit. It was a rolling 5-year mandate. So now because we're a year ahead, he only has to do it in 2016-17. If he makes that claim in the budget, he will be shredding his credibility in the city, and he ought to be shredding his credibility with journalists. It will be the worst, be beyond anything that Gordon Brown, the worst of Gordon Brown's smoke and mirrors, in his darkest nightmares. Right? That is a preposterous claim. Here is a fiscal strategy that would be compatible with that. Right? You start with 100 billion of structural deficit. Here's my plan to eliminate the structural deficit according to this. I'm going to announce 100 billion in permanent tax rises to commence from next year. Right? At the start of next year, so that gets rid of my structural deficit. The start of next year, I shall announce a set of temporary one-off 1-year tax cuts of £100 billion. Right? Well, it's only temporary, 1 year, so for the next, by the time it ends of the forecast horizon, the structural deficit will have gone. Right? That's what the forecast will say. At the commencements I'll go through next year, my deficit will be 100 billion. Beginning of the next year, I'm going to announce a different set of 100 billion of tax cuts to apply in that year. Of course, the structural deficit on the 5-year rolling horizon will still be zero. But what the reality is that every year the structural deficit will be £100 billion. What he's saying, if he does this, is saying, I'm not promising ever to eliminate the structural deficit. The point of a rolling mandate is not that you don't have to meet it in between, it's that you're saying I'm going to meet it in 2015-16 and in 2017-18 and in 2020-21, right? I always have to do it. That's the point of a rolling mandate, not that I get myself out of the responsibility of meeting it ever. Anyway, his options here, in my view, are to accept he'll miss and only reach the target later. He might be able to get away with that. He could announce some measures to increase the sustainable growth rate so that he eliminates some of the target that way, and he ought to be doing some of that. He could announce some additional spending cuts and tax rises to meet his target. I don't recommend doing that at this stage. Or he could announce a commitment to do whatever is necessary to meet the target, but put off specifying precisely what. So the things that I favour him doing at this stage are to announce some growth-enhancing measures for the medium term, and to put off any specific commitments, but specify a general commitment to eliminating the structural deficit and maintaining his target to do whatever it takes. I'll explain a little bit more of that in a moment. The most significant way he can increase the sustainable growth rate, apart from cutting spending faster, is to enhance productivity growth in the public sector. The things the government has the most control over are how much it spends itself and how efficiently it spends it. If the public sector productivity had grown as fast as private sector productivity from 1997 to 2007, real GDP growth, true GDP growth, would have been about 0.5 percentage point faster. Right? 0.5% you've got just by matching. In fact, it fell behind something of the order of a third. So you've got a huge gap. So even without any catch-up, you've got the scope there, if you just had it match, to get something like 0.5%. Next to that, 0.5% number, enormous in the context of maybe only 1% as your actual number. And you're making it grow half as fast again. All these other discussions of abolishing maternity leave and lots of regulatory bonfires, they're all rounding errors. All these other things are rounding errors. If the way to achieve faster growth in this economy, the thing over which they have the most control is the productivity growth of the public sector. The way that they can deliver that is by using the methods which the private sector uses to deliver its productivity growth. We need to see the use of markets and quasi-markets, of profit motives, and other kinds of private sector methods in the public sector. If the government says it wants growth, but then isn't willing to introduce those kind of measures, the ones which actually get it the big numbers in terms of faster growth, then it's just talk, right? It's perhaps willing the end, but it definitely isn't willing the means. Extra government infrastructure spending, they've talked about. I'll just say very briefly, I think that's unlikely to make much difference to valuable growth. One of the reasons the private sector isn't investing is because there's enormous uncertainty about the long-term outlook for the economy. So you have the significant danger of creating lots of white elephants. Just for example, suppose that we had an enormous further recession created by events in the Eurozone. A collapse of the Eurozone could imply a significant change in the pattern of our future trade. A significant change in our pattern of our future trade could have implications, for example, for where people live in the country. So you'd end up building lots of fancy transport systems, and nobody would in the end use them in 10 or 15 years' time, because they'd be living somewhere different, because we'd be trading with, who knows, America, China, whatever, instead of with Europe. Immediate credit easing measures, well, I think that, again, you run the risk of actually triggering the guarantees. The government talks as if this isn't actually spending any money providing guarantees. Of course it is, right? It is putting money on the table if you provide guarantees of this sort. And I think that if things go ugly, as they might, then there's every chance of them being triggered. It would be much better if they want to increase the flow of credit, to increase the functioning of the banking sector. The way to do that is for the government to disentangle itself from the banks and to relax on things like prudential requirements, and to introduce some of the measures they've talked about for next time, such as deposit preference and bail-ins, some of the kind of Vickers reforms that are only certain of them. The other key way to release private sector investment is not government guarantees, it's greater certainty of inflation, in my view. The government should set an inflation target at a level it's actually willing to enforce, and then enforce it. The current regime has become a farce. This business where every year the Chancellor sets a target he doesn't want them to meet, then the governor sends him a letter saying, well, I didn't try to meet it because it wouldn't be a good idea, and then the Chancellor sends him back a letter saying, well, I'm glad you didn't try to meet it because obviously it would have been stupid to try to meet my target, is preposterous. They need to set the target at a level they're willing to enforce and then actually enforce it. Beyond promoting growth, though, in my view, there should be no additional spending cuts or tax rises announced at this stage. Right? Uncertainty regarding the euro is so great, the consequences of a collapse so huge, that any plans announced at this stage could well be rendered irrelevant in 6 months. Maybe that's too long, right? They could be rendered irrelevant in 3 weeks. I think it would be just silly to commit to plans at this stage, which would be rendered irrelevant so quickly, when what you're talking about is a plan that plans for what happens in 2014, 15, 16. Stick to the plan for this year, and I think that they should be committing to do whatever is necessary in the future to meet their structural target and to make sure that that 2015-16 number still holds. And they should announce perhaps a general commitment that the way that they will do that involves about 80% of spending cuts, about 20% of tax rises. So indicate the ratio, but don't unpack the numbers. Beyond that, my last point, masterful inaction is in my view the desirable course. So they should ignore siren pleas for slowing the pace of spending cuts or lots of pet schemes. Of course they'll have to do some pet schemes, that's what politicians exist for. But government can do relatively little to make things better for now, but a lot to make things worse.